Before we kick off the show, if you're a fan of History Hack, please do what you can to support the show. We completely get that not everyone is able or willing to dig into their pockets. Times are hard, but by dropping a like, subscribing on Twitter and YouTube, and importantly, leaving a review wherever you get your podcasts, you can help the programme grow and reach more people. If you're interested in becoming a supporter, go to patreon.com/historyhack, where you'll find perks from secret Facebook groups to early release material. If you just want to leave us a one-off tip, go to ko-fi.com/historyhack. The links are in the description. And whatever form your kind support takes, know that we are massively grateful. Enjoy the show.
Hello and welcome to History Hack. You've got the History Hack sisters here with you today. You've got Beth presenting up front and a lovely Charlie. Charlie, how are you today?
I'm very good, thank you. It's nice to be with the Anna to my Elsa again.
Yes, indeed, of course. And we really did take the Anna to the Elsa very literally, didn't we, with our appropriate hair colours. But, you know, absolutely got to live that life to the full. Absolutely. So, Charlie, who have we got with us today?
Oh, we've got a real treat for you today. We've got a returning guest today, which we love here at History Hack. We've got Miranda Malins with us. She's a historian specialising in Oliver Cromwell and the Protectorate. Leave gap for boos and hisses. A trustee of the Cromwell Association. We've already talked to her about her debut historical novel, The Puritan Princess. And we're thrilled to have her back with us today to tell us about its prequel, The Rebel Daughter. Hello, Miranda.
Hi, Charlie. Hi, Beth. Thank you for having me back on the show.
Oh, we'd love having you here, and we're sorry in advance for all the ribbing that you get from a pair of royalists.
It's fine. I love it. Bring it on.
Well, yeah, we know that you can take it. We know that the Cromwell Association are just a fantastic group of people, and they're doing some really great work, and they can always take a joke on Twitter.
Absolutely.
So, The Puritan Princess was all about Frances Cromwell, and anyone who hasn't listened to our chat on that should go back because it was fantastic, and she was the baby of the family. The Rebel Daughter is all about the eldest sister of the family. So what do we know about Bridget Cromwell, and where do we find her at the start of your story?
Well, we know she was the third child of the Cromwell's eventual 9 children.
Blimey.
And she's the third of 9 and the eldest sister. It's a very different, contrasting kind of heroine for me this time, from the youngest sister to the oldest sister, and the family dynamics that come along with that. So she was born in 1624, which means that at the outbreak of the war, she was about 18. And it means it gives her very, very different perspective on her father and on the wars from her younger siblings, because she witnessed her father's kind of lowest ebb in the 1630s, where he lost lots of money and he was in reduced circumstances as merely a tenant farmer. And then he had a period of depression and a religious conversion, sort of spiritual awakening, and then a piece of good fortune and inheritance, which allowed him to kind of climb back into the ranks of the gentry. And then the outbreak of the war itself. So she sees all of that at first hand, and is an adult through all of the wars. And indeed we'll come on to this, but, gets very involved in them herself. So, I felt she was a really exciting protagonist through which to tell the story of the 1640s, the Civil Wars, and Oliver Cromwell's rise.
That's absolutely fantastic. And in terms of where she is geographically, we can't go through this conversation without discussing the beautiful city of Ely. And you can actually see where Bridget Cromwell grew up in a way.
You can. It's absolutely amazing. It's spine-tingling. It's Cromwell's house in Ely is still there, and if any of you listeners haven't been there, I do urge you to go, because it's so atmospheric, and you see this ordinary, it's a very nice house, quite a large house, but it's an ordinary family house in the centre of Ely, just a stone's throw from the cathedral, next to the parish church. and it's where the Cromwells were at the outbreak of the war, and they lived there for quite some time. And you can still wander around it. You can still be in the very kitchen with the same flagstone floors and large fireplace and large windows onto the garden, where the Cromwell women in my books, are making the meals and chatting to each other over the washing up. So that's really amazing. And then to reflect that self-same family who lived in that really quite small house, when you think that there are so many children, and a spinster aunt as well, and a grandmother, as well as Oliver Cromwell and his wife. When you think that self-same family end up in the palaces of Hampton Court and Whitehall, living as royalty, that's just such an extraordinary story.
Goodness me. Well, I can tell our listeners now that you have done a fantastic job of bringing that location to life, because I grew up in Ely and I know Cromwell's house very well. My great grandmother, in fact, used to be the cleaner of the house. Not when Cromwell was there, I should say. This was many years later. So
did she ever see Cromwell's ghost in the house?
Oh, now do you know what? I don't know, but I would have. Oh, that would have been amazing if she had. I wonder if she was the kind of woman who would have believed it if she'd seen it. I didn't know her very well. She'd gone by the time I was old enough to talk to her about it. But the house is just, it is, you're right, it's got an energy about it, and it's so special and very worth seeing.
Yes, it has. I absolutely love it. I'm doing an event there, actually. Just to plug my event. In about a month's time, on the 22nd of April, I'm doing a talk at Cromwell's house, a ticketed talk with, a glass of wine and everything. And I'm so excited at the prospect of speaking in that place where they all lived. I'm going to be beside myself. The romantic in me is going to just go crazy. So very excited about that.
Fantastic.
We all have those things, though, don't we? Like, oh, that sounds delightful. A glass of wine and sitting in the house. Like, we've all got those things, haven't we? It's like, well, I'd love to be doing this and this in this place, and Charlie with this, and so on. It's a historian's dream, isn't it?
It is, isn't it? And I think it's something that all historians, or frankly anyone who loves history, like your listeners, has in common, is that sense of place. Yeah. You can't love history and the stories of history without being someone who has that sort of extra antennae, that when you walk around places, you like to think of who lived there before and what the life there was like, and you pick up on that atmosphere. And I love that. It's one of my favorite things about working on the past.
Do you touch the walls and the floors? And
oh, I do. No, I'm a total nut about it. I once stayed apparently the hotel room where Charles I had stayed. I'm trying to remember. I think it was Newark. We were talking about Newark earlier. And I just couldn't go to sleep all night, because I was like, he slept in this room, maybe, possibly, probably, and it was just, I was just giddy with excitement. I'm a real little girl when it comes to that stuff.
You're in good company.
So a big part of the story of the book is Bridget's relationship and her romance with Henry Ireton. Can you just give us a brief rundown of who he is? Where does he fit into the world that is the Cromwell family?
Of course. So Henry Ireton comes from Nottinghamshire, and he's the eldest son of probably a similar family to the Cromwells, kind of minor gentry. His, rather like Oliver's own father, died young. Henry Ireton's father died young and left him responsible for his widowed mother and all of his siblings. But actually it's quite quirky, because at that time in Nottinghamshire they had a system of ultimogeniture, so the opposite of primogeniture, which meant that the youngest son inherited, not the oldest son. So Henry was in a very sort of odd position of being the oldest in his family and feeling responsible for all of his siblings and his mother, but not actually getting the estate at the end of the day. So he has to really sort of make his own way in the world, and he goes to Trinity College, Oxford, and then the Middle Temple. And then the Civil War gives him an opportunity to make a name for himself. And it's something I tried to capture in the book, actually, about the armies, particularly the parliamentarian army, is that there were a lot of second sons, there were a lot of, spares rather than the heir, who found fortune and fame and proved themselves in the army, because it was it was a very egalitarian group of people. It was somewhere where it didn't particularly matter actually who you were. If you were talented, you could rise up and be recognized. And Henry was very, very talented, enormously clever, and very hard worker, could be very inflexible and stubborn. He ends up being the army's best theoretician, best kind of writer of best debater and writer of the army's position as the army increasingly gets involved in politics. So he's about 32 at the start of the war, so quite a bit older than Bridget. And he comes across Oliver Cromwell through in the early couple of years of the war. They fight together at Gainsborough and then sort of become friends. And then Henry Ireton comes back to Ely with Oliver when Oliver becomes governor of the Isle of Ely, and he makes Henry Ireton his deputy. And that's the beginning really of an enormously close collegiate kind of working, but also very close friendship between the two men. So yes, when the book starts and when we meet Henry, he's almost a protege of Bridget's father, Oliver, and driving the kind of army position forward, and increasingly as the army becomes more radicalized and more ambitious.
Oh, amazing. It's actually worth backtracking a little bit from that point, because I think that, you know, in terms of the ways that we reduce the Civil War to make it easy to digest, I think everybody just thinks Oliver Cromwell was in charge. So it was King Charles versus Oliver Cromwell and a battle royale to the death. But Oliver Cromwell is not top dog at the beginning of the Civil War, is he?
It's so true, Charlie. It's such a great point, and it's one of the major myths, one of the many myths about the Civil War, which surprisingly few people actually really know, which is that, as you say, you know, at the beginning, right through the first few years of the war, Oliver Cromwell is very, very minor figure. He's a local cavalry commander, really, in Cambridgeshire. And, you know, he proves himself on the battlefield and he shows his ability. But, you know, it's really not until several years into the war that he gets a seat at the kind of central table and eventually becomes a member of the Committee for Two Kingdoms, which runs the war effort when the Scots join with the English. But it's a really, really interesting point, and it's something I really tried to bring out in the book, is that exact fact that he really is on the fringe of all of this, and he's frustrated by that because he's effectively a nobody. And so this idea that the parliamentarian army is led by Cromwell is a total myth. He doesn't in fact become the overall commander of Parliament's army until after the king has died. He did until, you know, the campaigns in the Third Civil War in Scotland. So all of this time, he is just one of a number of bright, brilliant men who are running this effort and making all these decisions in a collaborative way. And Sir Thomas Fairfax is the commander later of the New Model Army, which is the kind of way that the Parliament's army becomes professionalized and becomes this fighting force that eventually wins the First Civil War. And it's Sir Thomas Fairfax is the commander-in-chief, not Oliver Cromwell.
Gosh. And it becomes, I mean, the army at this point, it's so fascinating from a military point of view that it becomes more of a meritocracy as it goes along, and you are getting these bright sparks who are becoming advanced. But before we can get to that, we need to talk about someone who's standing in the way, which you do very neatly in the book. You actually you make all of this very digestible in a family setting. Tell us about the Earl of Manchester. Why did Cromwell invite the Earl of Manchester for dinner?
Well, thank you for the compliment, because I was trying to make it all read quite easily, but actually a lot of work goes behind the scenes to, as you say, make this incredibly complicated war with shifting alliances and lots of different points of view kind of digestible, and not let it get in the way of the plot and keep the family center stage. But yes, the Earl of Manchester Again, this comes back to our question of who is Oliver Cromwell during the First Civil War. And actually, the army is run by, commanded by various members of the nobility, the Earl of Essex and the Earl of Manchester and various others. Again, just to debunk another myth here, the idea that all the nobility are on the royalist side and all of the kind of common people are on Parliament side is again a total myth. There's some really powerful nobles on Parliament's side, and as this is the kind of hierarchical society we see in the early modern period, they take the lead, they take command, and they clash. The Earl of Manchester and Oliver Cromwell come across each other before the war. They actually, because they're both local figures in East Anglia, and they actually clash over various local matters to do with the draining of the fens and enclosure, and they sort of clash with each other over that. Then they find themselves on the same side in Parliament's war, and there is this sense increasingly of a divergence in the parliamentarian army leadership as the First Civil War goes on, between the noble leaders who it's felt that they're not actually really trying to win the war outright. They're trying to kind of put up a good show in the field so that they can negotiate with the King Charles, from a position of strength. It's quite a sort of civilized attitude. Whereas for some of the less noble kind of generals and army grandees in Parliament's army, like Oliver Cromwell, feel that they're expending a lot of blood and effort and casualties here in this war, which is getting increasingly violent. And really, why did they go to war in the first place? It wasn't to actually push through to outright victory. The Earl of Manchester is meant to have made this famous remark about how if the king, if the king beats them 99 times, if they beat the king 99 times, he's still king. But if he beats them once, they are all hanged and their estates taken away. And that just sums up the incredible bravery of the parliamentarians. Everything is on the line for them here. They are the rebels here. So there's a clash in the army leadership, especially after the great victory of Marston Moor. There's a sense that this victory is being squandered by this kind of inept leadership who aren't really kind of committed enough to the cause. And so, cut a long story short, there's arguments in the Parliament about this. They pass what's called self-denying ordinance, which is a sneaky way of saying that no one who's an MP can also be a commander of the army, or an MP or a lord. And so it's meant to oust all of these inconvenient aristos. And then they find some brilliant series of loopholes through which Oliver Cromwell can carry on as an army general, even though he's an MP, on a sort of rolling contract basis. I love that. and then they professionalize the army into a formidable fighting force called the New Model Army. They appoint a new commander, Sir Thomas Fairfax, who everyone's happy with, and then they storm to victory at Naseby. They win the First Civil War, and then they feel that they are God's instrument for this victory, going into the peace negotiations and thereafter. Sorry, that's a very long answer.
No, it's a great answer. It is complicated stuff, but it is very, very well done in the book. I like Manchester. I find him a fascinating character. I find anybody who was this involved, so Manchester, Fairfax, who was this close to general command of the rebel forces, who gets away with it, but not only gets away with it, Manchester becomes Lord Chamberlain to Charles II at his restoration.
I know, isn't that amazing? It's just amazing. And again, it comes back to a theme that we've discussed before, haven't we, of the extraordinary level of continuity from the 1650s into the Restoration. This is a small, this is a small network of people, men chiefly, in this establishment. They all know each other. They're all related to each other. They all have to kind of get civilized life back together after the war. And as you say, Sir Thomas Fairfax ends up being hugely important in enabling the king's restoration. This is the man who spent all these years fighting against his father. So, I think it was actually, really this is what's so fascinating about a civil war, is that this is a war within a kingdom, within the same political classes, within the same families, within the same friendship circles, which is something you don't get from foreign wars, state on state wars, where the enemy is just the enemy. Here, the enemy isn't the enemy. The enemy are people that you actually really know very well, and in some cases like and respect. So it's very hard.
Absolutely. And so that's all very interesting. I really enjoyed that little insight there, but we'll bring it back to the book now. So Bridget, obviously the main character is Bridget in your book, and her story also really provides insight into women's roles in the Civil War. We see her working in the nursing role, but she later joins the women that are following the army, and encounters the military hierarchy that is in place at that time, due to being in the presence of Lady Fairfax, and obviously you've just mentioned her husband. So instead of telling us more about her husband, tell us about Anne, because she is quite the stuff of legend, is she not? Who is she in your book?
I'd love to. She's fabulous. I just see she's so interesting. And again, it was something I really wanted to capture in this book, was this sense that there is a powerful network of women here too. The wives of the leading army figures on the parliamentarian side are a formidable group of women in their own right, and again all have relationships with each other. Anne Fairfax was known as the Generaless, which I love. Again, that sense that she's there with her husband, and that just captures the fact that she was a force to be reckoned with, and the fact that she had a kind of a semi-official, unofficial commanding position, which I think is brilliant. And we know that, and we know that Bridget was there with her, with the army a lot of the time, because we have letters from Oliver Cromwell to Bridget and others, and they're addressed to her at General Fairfax's HQ, and they say, "Give my affection and thanks to the General and the Generaless, who I know you're very close to and who are looking after you." So that dynamic I didn't make that up. That is absolutely what was happening. But Anne Fairfax but she's attacked, as many of these prominent women were in the press, in these kind of scandalous newspapers. It was a way, as ever throughout history, of attacking men, was to attack their wives or lovers or mistresses, and sort of make the whole thing, sexualized almost. And there was this idea at the time, this fear that if the nation could rebel against its king, then were wives going to be rebelling against their husbands in parallel? There's a really interesting dynamic. Yes, I know, but there's such an interesting dynamic there, and a lot of us who write about this period do so partly because it gave wonderful opportunities for women to show strength and leadership, whether it was running their husbands' businesses when they went off to fight, or as widows, or in some cases defending their homes, defending their castles. There were some formidable royalist ladies who were defending their castles and estates. And there are these remarkable women preachers. There are women pamphleteers like John Milburn's wife, Elizabeth. And I was very keen in the book to foreground all of these different women and all these different kind of modes of being a woman, all these different ways in which a woman at this time could have agency. Spies, there were a lot of female spies working for both, particularly for Parliament's side, but for both sides in the war. But coming back to Anne Fairfax, yes, she became very scandalous when at the trial of Charles I, she reputedly sort of heckled from the public gallery, because her husband was meant to be one of the judges, but he didn't turn up because he didn't want to get involved in it, and she heckles because she disapproves of the regicide. So she was clearly an amazing woman. So someone I definitely wanted to include and have as a major character in the book.
It's really lovely to read because as someone who's read a lot of Civil War histories, it's lovely to see these names: Fleetwood, Lambert, Ireton, all of the names, but with a female Christian name. So you're actually talking about the wives, and you've given them such agency in discussing what's going on, but in a female setting. It's
thank you. That really meant a great deal to me in the book to do that, and I don't think it's too much of a stretch of the imagination either. I mean, women in this period, particularly in these sort of puritanical circles, but not too kind of extremely puritanical, but sort of, you know, in the gentry, you know, women wives were central to their husbands' lives, and the Puritan attitude to marriage was very much that it was the foundation for a happy and fulfilled emotional life, spiritual life, family life. These aren't the women that we think of as kind of traveling over on the Mayflower with white collars and silent until, you know, and silent and in the corner of rooms. Cromwell himself was surrounded by women his whole life and loved them and always and wrote to them endlessly and always asked their opinion on things, had great female friendships as well. He's a kind of woman's man, Cromwell. And, you know, he's got so much time for all the women in his life. And so I didn't feel it was a huge stretch particularly. And in terms of the other army leaders' wives, I mean, General Lambert, John Lambert's wife, Frances, was apparently enormously impressive and beautiful and erudite. Very grand. There were rumours at the time that she and Oliver Cromwell were having an affair, which I don't think any historian takes seriously. But again, there's brilliant evidence of how these women are there because they have to be there because they otherwise why would the rumour mongers and gossip writers use them in these ways to make these points? So there's a lot of satire happening right now that is based around the wives. Mrs. Cromwell being, you know, from a country bumpkin, Mrs. Fairfax being wearing the trousers, Mrs. Lambert having an affair with Oliver Cromwell. This is all right there in public discourse. So these were clearly formidable women in their own right. Gosh,
amazing. Wow. If you think Cromwell liked the company of women, you should meet Charles II.
A very different way of enjoying female company.
You know, this is the sort of the women in your book. This is great, and it's so exciting to hear these voices. But let's talk about sisters. There's a wonderful simmering rivalry that you explain between Bridget and her closest sister in age, Elizabeth. So do we know anything concrete about how the sisters interacted with each other, or is the relationship imagined, you know, because they even start to represent different political ideologies later in the story? Were they really so different? I mean, I don't have sisters myself. Beth has the experience of sisters. Is it imagined or is it real? Do we know?
In which case Beth will understand particularly because I'm the youngest of three sisters.
See, I'm the oldest of three sisters.
There you go. So I'm hoping you'll identify with Bridget then. So I very much identified with Frances and the Puritan Princess. So I channeled all my younger sister angst through her. And then for Bridget, I had to really put myself in the older sister's shoes and think about how my older sister feels about things, which was quite funny, quite a funny exercise. But yes, I mean, I have to say at the outset, I mean, these are novels, so a lot of the dynamic between the sisters I imagined in order to create the kind of compelling plot that would, you know, keep people reading. I had very much as a tangent, I had in mind the sisters in The Taming of the Shrew, and also the Dashwood sisters from Sense and Sensibility, and various other examples where there's a slightly sort of serious, stern, pragmatic older sister and a younger sister who's incredibly beautiful and everyone loves, and you know, that sort of thing. We're even now seeing that in the latest series of Bridgerton, so it's clearly a good dynamic that everyone's interested in. What we do know is that all of the siblings in the Cromwell family were very close. We have a lot of letters between them which show that. And they were a very informal family. It's another reason I love them. They all have nicknames for each other and they all gossip and they all, you know, they were really, and again, it takes us back to Cromwell's house in Ely. You've got to imagine them all sharing rooms, sharing beds, you know, it's terribly intimate kind of setup, which again is not the kind of relationship that those who are born royal would necessarily have with each other, all around the kitchen table. You know, you didn't have that. They often had their own households, didn't they, princes and princesses, thinking of Henry VIII's children or whatever. But in terms of these two girls, we do have insights into the fact that they are very different personalities. We have various letters from Oliver. We have a great letter from him to Bridget, which gives some real insight into hers and Betty's personalities. Betty, he talks about as being rather sort of vain and interested in worldly things, or kind of a carnal mind, as he puts it. But you have to remember this is 17th century language. So what he's getting, he basically worries that Betty is too frivolous and not godly enough. And he worries, because he's such a doting father, he worries that Bridget is almost too godly and doesn't enjoy life enough. That's what comes through these letters. So there is a difference between them. And similarly, in their later lives during his rule as Lord Protector, Betty, Elizabeth, is very much the kind of queen bee of the social scene, and everyone loves her. She's just kind of adored, and she's this princess and everything. And Bridget is much more, hangs back rather more, and is, at that point married. You don't want to give away the plot too much, but she's married to another army general, and she is very much with the army on that kind of thing. Whereas Betty ends up marrying a very different man, John Claypole, who's a local kind of family friend. Was derided by Lucy Hutchinson, the Puritan, as being a kind of real cavalier, because he was a kind of, a bit like Richard Cromwell. He was a kind of hunting, shooting, fishing, sort of have his dogs around him, likes a good time, likes a glass of wine kind of guy. And again, this comes to fruition during the kingship crisis in 1657, where Parliament tries to make Cromwell king, because Betty's husband, John Claypole, is one of the leading MPs who's trying to push for Cromwell to accept the crown. And so that kind of moderate civilian wing of the Protectorate court, whereas Bridget's husband is very much hates this idea, or persuades Cromwell not to take the crown. He's there with Lambert and with Desborough, very much with the army, saying we don't want a monarchy. So it's not too much of a stretch of the imagination, given what we know about the closeness of these couples and of marriages at this time, to think, and what we know about Betty and Bridget's personalities, to put them on, on those different sides of political debates.
Sisterly rivalry is a topic that comes round and round again, but it's still, because it's ever present, isn't it? It is so true. I don't know about you, Miranda, but as I said, I'm the oldest of three. My next sister is 2 years younger than me, but my youngest sister is 12 years younger than me. So there's a big age gap. But as you say, those dynamics, the oldest sister, usually the one who's you just think about like Jane Austen and anything who's like the oldest daughter must marry and must be the one it's that dynamic, isn't it, of the oldest daughter. It speaks so strongly to me.
Thank you. And that, I find it fascinating too, and that intensity of relationship with siblings, boys and girls, but particularly here I'm writing about sisters, where there's such intense love between them, but also real rivalry and competition. And that never goes away. You always compare yourself to your sisters. You don't mean to, it's just in your DNA that you do that. I'm the youngest, so I always measure myself against my older sisters, even as an adult now. It's just a default position. And I very much tried to capture in these 2 books the fact that, again, an interesting thing about this family of 9 children, 6 of whom make it into full adulthood, is that there are 2 pairs of sisters who are many years apart in age. There's 2 older sisters, Bridget and Betty, and the 2 younger sisters, Mary and Frances. And the 2 older girls grow up with their father being, at one time really quite poor, but very much an ordinary man. And they make marriages to sort of local gentry, similar stock. And then they're adults throughout the war and the regicide, the politics, and they're adults to see their father become head of state. Whereas the 2 younger girls, they only reach their majority when their father is effectively king, and they're living as unmarried princesses at his court. And their marriages are potentially into the highest ranks in the nobility, if not, into kind of European princes, perhaps even Charles II, it was rumored, himself. So, what a different experience of family life, and what would that do to your sisterly relationships? I find that very, very interesting.
I love the comparison between Miss Dashwood and Marianne. I can totally see that, because even a quick Google, if anyone wants to Google Elizabeth Claypole, you'll see the most beautiful portrait of Betty which looks like it could have hung with the Windsor Beauties. I mean, she
absolutely
is clearly a stunner. Do we have a portrait of Bridget?
We do. We have a couple of portraits of her, actually. And again, it's really, really interesting to see them, because she's less of a stunner than Betty, and she's a bit more sort of severe looking. But the thing, again, to counter these myths that we have about this period, she's still dressed in finery. We have a wonderful portrait of her dressed in this beautiful yellow gown, which is the one I describe her getting married in, just because it's the one in the portrait, so I wanted to bring that in, with pearls and trim and hair and ringlets. So, you know, and she was thought of at the time by her contemporaries as being this kind of Puritan, godly woman, and yet there she is in this beautiful dresses. So Anne Fairfax the same. You know, all of these women, they weren't what we think of as Puritan women. When we imagine a Puritan woman, it wasn't what these women looked like. These women looked like Charles II's mistresses in terms of their outfits. And again, that just reminds us of the continuity in this period into the Restoration. You know, the 1650s are so often sort of, and 40s, but so often written off as kind of superstitious, backwards, kind of dark times, and then the Restoration comes kind of bringing the light and the Enlightenment, and Samuel Pepys buzzing around coffee houses and going to the theatre. Well, the first coffee houses are opening in the 1650s, and you know, Christopher Wren and Samuel Pepys and other Restoration figures begin their careers not only under the Protectorate, but in Wren's case, sponsored by Oliver himself. He gives Wren one of his first breaks by getting him a chair at Gresham College. So, you know, our whole myth of kind of door Roundheads, it isn't right. It's not right there. Oliver Cromwell's court was one where there was Andrew Marvell, John Milton, William Davenant composing the first opera in English is under the Protectorate. So they have masks and feasts and parties. You know, it's we have to rethink this whole period. All the stereotypes that we have are quite wrong, really.
God, don't listen to her, listeners. Don't listen to her. Don't spreading her propaganda.
Oh, I know, but I'm almost saying, though, because I love the Restoration too, I'm almost saying, if you love the Restoration, come back to the 50s and you'll find more such, you know, you'll find yourself in more familiar territory than you'd think, basically.
More 17th century stuff all round.
Exactly.
I'm here for it. And it is much more colourful and much more complicated than people ever give it credit for.
Exactly.
Historically, obviously, as you said, it is a novel, but most of what you are writing has got its element in fact. You know, they're not made up characters, they are real historical figures. And you talked briefly earlier about the tension that arises between Parliament and the army, and you can't be an MP if you're a general, and so on and so forth. Throw into the fact that this is a particular problem after the First Civil War, but throw into it that the need to negotiate with the king. And the whole country becomes a melting pot of ideas and ideals, and everything looks like it's about to fall apart. What's going to happen? Where does Bridget fit into this? You know, this really quite it's not a period I know much about, but really quite a interesting period of time that still has its repercussions today, really, doesn't it?
It does. It really, really does. And it's this. You said melting pot, and that's absolutely right. It's this fascinating sort of Pandora's box of intellectual firmament, I guess, is opened by the Civil War. And suddenly, you know, the unthinkable has happened. You know, the Parliament has gone to war with the king. And, you know, there's also an explosion in printing because censorship falls away. And suddenly everyone's got their ideas as to what they should do next. And as so often in history, even you know, in the present day, it's always seems so much easier to agree on what you're against and then to pull something down than it is to agree with what you want and to build something up. And you know, this is the sort of mess that they get into. And the other thing is, I mean, this is an alliance, as we said at the very beginning. This isn't Cromwell versus the king. This isn't even really just Parliament versus the king. Within Parliament, there are broadly two factions, the Presbyterian faction and the Independent faction. There's also an increasingly radical and separate army, which is its own sort of entity and political force. And then you also have the Scots, who are an allied sort of totally separate nation, really, although they share the same king. They are a separate nation who side first with Parliament and then later with the king. So all of these different sides have different views. And then within the army itself, you have the army commanders who might think one thing, and the rank and file who think another. And they're also influenced by radical sects, particularly the Levellers who come from London, who have their own sort of political ideals that are familiar to us later down the centuries as a sort of Chartist ideas and ideas of kind of, broadening the franchise. And this is what they're discussing at the famous Putney debates. So as you say, it's a huge sort of spectrum of interest groups here, all also reacting constantly to changing events. So the landscape around them is constantly shifting, not least the king and what the king is doing and who the king is playing off against who, and what terms he will or won't accept. Pretty much everyone at this time still wants to keep the king, still wants to keep a monarchy. But increasingly, as the years go on, especially once there's a second and even more brutal civil war, there are more calls for to try and put on trial Charles I and possibly abolish the monarchy. So there is a kind of increasing radicalization that happens. And in terms of where Bridget is, I mean, I just see her very much at Henry Ireton's elbow, her husband, who they were such a clearly a very close kind of intellectual pairing, I think. And I found it so intriguing to think that she was the daughter of Oliver Cromwell and she was married to Henry Ireton. And increasingly during the revolution that ends up with Pride's purge of Parliament and then the trial and execution of the king, Cromwell and Ireton are the kind of twin leading figures of this movement. And Bridget is the daughter of one and the wife of the other. So, and living with them. So, I mean, how could she not be in the thick of that? Especially as she's outspoken. We know she was outspoken and religious and strong-willed. So yeah, I guess where she ends up with Henry Ireton is Henry Ireton comes around to the idea that really the king has gone too far in his double dealing and cannot be kept on his throne. I think he probably comes to that realization sooner than Oliver Cromwell. Oliver's working later to try and keep the king a part of the picture. Whereas Henry Ireton, because he's such a thinker, he's a real political theorist in a way in which Oliver Cromwell just isn't. He's not a man of, he's famously, reads men, not books, whereas Ireton is a real kind of firebrand thinker. And it's Henry Ireton who starts to condense the ideas of both the Levellers and also the kind of army and put them into kind of political terms and drafts a lot of these documents, the heads of proposals that they give to the king, the remonstrance, which is the eventual army document that calls for the king's trial. And Ireton, historians are increasingly thinking that Ireton is the main writer of some of these documents. There was more question before whether it was more of a kind of group of writers, but Ireton is increasingly being given credit as the main writer. So he is trying to map out a kind of political future and an idea of, do we get rid of Parliament, dissolve Parliament potentially, and try the king, and then come up with a new method of government. So I think I picture Bridget is there, passing him his inkwell, letting him read his drafts out loud to her, and very much there with him.
It's a real sort of exercise in soft power.
Yeah.
What she has is because she is literally at the table, at the dinner table, in their family home with her husband and her father, which is not an unusual thing for a woman to be, and bouncing ideas off the two of them and pushing them one way, pulling them the other. And she really is a force to be reckoned with.
Absolutely. And again, that, as you say, that dynamic is not uncommon, for a kind of woman to marry her father's sort of protege or deputy or colleague. That's quite a common story in especially in the past. And again, that just made me think, if Bridget is there with her father and her husband, how is she sort of trying to link the two? Is she trying to explain to her husband the best ways to convince her father of something because she knows her father inside out, and vice versa? Is she a go-between? And again, we have a wonderful letter, one of the letters we have from Cromwell to Bridget when she's away with the army in 1646. He writes it to her and he says, I'm writing to, basically I'm paraphrasing, but he says, I'm writing to you, not your husband, because one line of me to him makes him stay up all night writing endless lines back to me, and he works too hard, so I'm writing to you instead. But that just tells me that she's there. He's expecting her to pass on his thoughts to her husband. So she's in the conversation.
Gosh, this is the point at which this episode could be 4 hours long, because of course I'm very, very tempted to sit and talk to you all night about the political wranglings that came after the king's execution. And it's so pertinent, and I'm going to say it, I'm going to mention it, because we've had a plague and a war since then, but it is very, very like what we've lived through with Brexit, in that a decision was made, and the actual unpicking and the legal wranglings that have to happen in order for that then to be carried through, that's a much bigger question. So they suddenly realize, we're going to cut the king's head off. What will be the first words that come out of people's mouths when you kill a king?
Yeah. What do we do next? Exactly. The king's dead, long live the king. Which is why they hastily abolished the monarchy, because they realized actually Charles II is going to say he's king, so we need to abolish the whole thing. But you're so right, and I found it really extraordinary living through the Brexit period, because it felt so resonant for this period. I mean, I wrote a piece in History Today about this, actually, about that very resonance and that very idea that the referendum was a kind of big a very simple decision in some ways, and then what do you do afterwards? That's the complicated stuff, and that's the fascinating stuff, really. What do we want instead? We know what we don't want. What do we want next? And lots of historians at the time, I remember Neil Ferguson saying that he said something like that this was a splendidly Stuart style crisis or whatever. And a lot of us historians did feel that amazing kind of, suddenly the past, and especially our period, just leapt forward into the future. And suddenly the newspapers and the radio was full of words like royal prerogative and prorogation of parliament and the speaker, and what are the speaker's rights, and Speaker Lenthal was being cited, and you just say, oh wow, it's all come back to life again. I love that.
Someone referred to the grandees in Parliament, and I think every 17th century historian just did a little squee. So it was grandees.
Grandees, what a great word. Exactly. I mean, all of these terms, if you're someone who's lucky enough to work in this period or read about it or enjoy it, it has its own language and its own terminology, doesn't it? And this is why I love this period, the 17th century, the mid 17th century, is because it's the first time really where the fighting isn't about who should rule, Game of Thrones style. It's about how they should rule. And it's the beginning of everything. It's the beginning of journalism. It's the beginning of kind of the ideas of popular sovereignty, the beginning of the ideas of limited monarchy, all of the things that we now take for granted. And the arguments that we have now, the debates we have now about, for instance, what the balance should be between the protection that the state offers us and the freedoms that we enjoy from apart from the state, that all comes from Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, and these are the same arguments we're having today. And I love that. That's what's so brilliant about studying the past, is that it's illuminating of the present.
Absolutely. And so how do those, these, as you say, these political events that we are now seeing in our time, obviously, how do they relate to Bridget specifically? This new, well, what do you do once you've abolished a monarchy? Who, as you say, how do you rule? What do we know about her life in the Commonwealth and the Protectorate?
Yeah, well, we know that she went to Ireland with her husband, Henry Ireton, when he was out there in charge of the army, basically. And we know that she later went back to Ireland with her second husband. I won't go too much into the plot, so I don't spoil it for anyone. But the movements that I have her making in the book are real. She was in Ireland when I say she was, and she's back. That she then comes back in 1655, and her husband then is one of Cromwell's major generals. So the experiment of kind of regional military leadership, which goes so badly wrong, it's a terrible idea. And so her husband is one of those major generals ruling a great swathe of England. And she doesn't live, it's quite interesting to me, she's the only Cromwell sibling who doesn't live in the royal palaces. She lives just outside on Whitehall in Wallingford House with her husband, which later becomes famous as a sort of conspiratorial HQ for members, army grandees, as we say, to plot against the Protectorate. And again, I mean, it's such an I find it so sort of sad and poignant, all this, and I go into it in much more detail in The Puritan Princess, because that's set in the 1650s, that really the Protectorate and then later sort of the whole Commonwealth experiment is brought down in this most stupendous own goal, I think, in all of British history, because the army leaders kind of scupper themselves. And if you'd said to them, and I try and have my characters having these conversations, if we do pull down the Protectorate, aren't we just opening the door for the king to come back? Which, of course, 18 months later or whatever, he does. So again, I see Bridget in this period. We know that she's there. We know that she is kind of on the army's side of these increasingly kind of divergent views of what Oliver Cromwell's Protectorate should become, whether it should be a kind of military regime or whether it should become more of a softer traditional monarchy. She's on the kind of military side of that. And so, I've sort of imagined the rest, I guess, in terms of how that dynamic would play out for her. I mean, she would have very much been torn between her husband's attitudes and decisions, some of them terrible, some of them disastrous, and her birth family, who he found himself kind of in conflict with. And again, it's the brilliant thing about particularly the parliamentarian side in the Civil War and interregnum, is all the falling out among thieves, all the fighting between them, because I mean, that's just fascinating, isn't it? And it's all, at the end of the day, it's all a family affair. The Protectorate is brought down by the new Lord Protector, Richard Cromwell, who's Oliver Cromwell's son. It's brought down by his brother-in-law and his uncle. So, if you like your kind of Tudor and Stuart dynastic feuds and stuff, you'll love this period, because it all comes down to family, which I love.
Exactly. So if you like EastEnders, you're gonna love it.
Absolutely,
you're gonna love it. Yeah, it eats itself. How I've always described it. It does. Itself. Women's voices are hard to find in history. So much of it being written and recorded by men, and men's perspective of those women. So we've talked about how the pamphleteers went after these women. How did you find Bridget's voice, and how much of your story is her, and how much of it is opinion that you're prepared to back up with your evidence?
No, it's a great question. I had to, just as you say, I had to work a lot harder to find Bridget's voice than I did, for instance, to find Oliver Cromwell's voice. I find writing kind of dialogue for Oliver Cromwell just a piece of cake, because his voice is so clear in my head from all my years of studying him. He's just such a vivid he's such a vivid voice. But for the women, they are so marginalized, as you say in the sources. We just have these glimpses of them, a letter here, a diary entry there, as you say, a sort of scandalous pamphlet here, a bit of gossip there, a portrait. It's much more of an exercise of reading between the lines, and this is where the fictionalizing does come in. I mean, I was a historian. I am a historian before I was a novelist, and I did think about writing a book about the women in Cromwell's family just from a straight history non-fiction point of view. But I just felt that I would constantly be frustrated. I'd constantly be having to write, I assume, Mrs. Cromwell would have felt this, or would have felt that, or would have done this, or would have done that, which I just thought would be so would end up annoying the reader. So I thought, actually, if I fictionalize them, I can imagine their voices, reinsert them back in the story, but try and make sure wherever possible to keep to the facts in terms of who they were in broad brushstrokes, what they were doing, who they were marrying, where they were, so that we can kind of rediscover them as part of this story to which they were central. But yeah, I mean, I had to imagine Bridget's voice in many ways. We have a few of her letters, and as I say, portraits. And I again also I wanted with her to reflect her strong faith. I wanted to have more kind of biblical references and thoughts of hers reaching for Bible precedents in a way in which Frances, the heroine of the Puritan Princess, doesn't do that so much. She and her younger sisters were much more sort of Anglican, really. Bridget was known to be the most puritanical of these sisters, so I wanted kind of God to be part in the mix here. But again, that's a balancing act, because you don't want to alienate your modern readers by making it all too hot and heavy and biblical. So there was a balancing act there. But the wonderful thing about writing about the Cromwell family is that I do find that they do come to me. It's not like purely inventing characters. I've written some fiction before where I've totally made up the characters, and that is a very different experience. With that, you feel you are God. You are totally picking and choosing exactly who they are to suit your story or to suit the points you want to make. Whereas with this, it's more nuanced. It's more of a delicate process. You're taking what you know and then trying to sort of build out around that in a compelling way. But once I started writing about Bridget, she actually came to life for me. And then as the book went on, I found that I could hear what she would have said, or what she would have thought, or what she would have been worried about. So hopefully that comes through in the book.
It does. And you're allowed to have an opinion.
Oh yeah.
Well, you're allowed to, if this had been a straight biography, you couldn't have had her perspective on all the people that she interacts with.
No, exactly. And again, I thought very carefully about that, because in both books it's a daughter's perspective on Oliver Cromwell, which gives me the liberty to be quite opinionated about him, because I'm writing about him as how his children may have seen him. But again, you're like this, Charlie, but I did try. Hopefully you noticed that I was a bit tougher on Cromwell in this book than I was in the Puritan Princess. I did, because obviously you've got to confront the horrors of Ireland, the divisions within the parliamentarian kind of family, and Bridget has real concerns about her father becoming head of state and what that would mean, and would he make the right decisions and everything. And I wanted in the Puritan Princess, because we're at the point later in the story where he's effectively king, he's Lord Protector, I deliberately tried to keep him a little bit at a distance. In the scenes, he's often across the room or he's being talked about. Whereas I tried to make Oliver Cromwell in this book, which is set 10 years earlier, when he's much more of an ordinary householder and husband and father, I really tried to make him earthy and right there and very intimate. And like the book opens with him just literally working in the fields. And I really wanted the readers to contrast that Cromwell with the Cromwell who's sitting on a throne, 10, 15 years later, and think, hang on, how did that guy become this guy? And looking at him through his daughters was a really, really great way into telling that story and telling their stories too.
Yeah. I know you and Charlie, and to myself now, I feel like I could try and contribute every so often, but we could go on all night. And this certainly is one of our podcasts where we could go on and on and on. And these are a joy to be on. So, Miranda, where can people get your book? Is it out for sale now?
It is. It's out. Thank you. Yeah, The Rebel Daughter, published by Orion. It is out for sale now in all good bookshops and online retailers. And you can get it as a paperback or as an ebook or on Audible. It's an audiobook as well. So yeah, do please grab a copy, and grab a copy of The Puritan Princess as well. And you can read them in either order. They're sort of standalone. If you've not read either of them yet, actually, you may as well start with this second one, because it takes place earlier. It's a bit confusing. But equally, if you've read The Puritan Princess already, The Rebel Daughter will appeal to you, because you get a sense of time unspooling backwards and working out origin stories, which I quite like as a historian. So do please grab a copy and enjoy. Let me know what you think on social media or anywhere else.
And that will also be on, I imagine, on the History Hack bookshop as well, if people want to go through History Hack as well, because they do get a small percentage of the proceedings to help us keep going and getting all these wonderful guests.
Both are highly recommended.
Yeah, glowing recommendation there from Charlie. I think any time that Charlie says anything good about books, you should just
I know, and especially as Charlie is such an ardent royalist. I mean, it really if she is exactly the person I'm trying to win over with my books.
I mean, you've taken some liberties with the fiction, making Oliver Cromwell likable.
I know, how dare I?
Wonderful.
Check it out, guys, you'll love it.